Hey, critical thinkers, welcome to the Healthy and Awake podcast. I am so excited for this episode. Dr. Jack Kruse is a neurosurgeon. He's world renowned. He says so many things in the health and wellness space that I think most people miss. So if you already know his work, you are going to love this episode because I did my best to explore topics that he does not necessarily go into quite as much. If you don't know who Dr. Kruse is, there's a lot of things that might be hard to pick up on in the episode. He frequently refers to the Huberman podcast. So if you know Andrew Huberman, the PhD from Stanford, Dr. Jack Kruse and Huberman did this huge podcast episode, huge in terms of length and in terms of reach, audience reach. So it might be a good idea to listen to that one first, maybe, but either way, I think you're going to love this episode. I still have so many questions, and I will add, sometimes the audio is a little bit off, especially in the beginning and the end. And by the end of it, the video and the audio was so delayed, it made it actually difficult to continue the conversation. So I kind of abruptly ended it without asking him to plug his own work, which I feel bad about. So I'm going to do that now. JackKruse.com. He is not the type of guy to push supplements or things that a lot of quacks, not that all supplements are bad, but he does not push things for the sake of making money. This guy really is all about the truth and spreading what he believes to be very important in the health and wellness space. So I really think a lot of what he said is so important for people to hear. And a lot of it's around circadian health. I could go on, but the episode's long enough, so maybe I should just shut up here. So please enjoy this episode with Dr. Jack Kruse, and definitely make sure to go to his website, jackkruse.com. And if you really like what he has to say, please make sure to sign up for his Patreon, where he goes really deep into a lot of these subjects. But without further ado, here we go. Well, let me start by saying, Dr. Jack Kruse, thank you so much for being here. Genuinely is an honor to speak with you. You are one of the most unique voices in the health and wellness space, and the paradigm that you present is so interesting. And I'll add that I really admire your relentless pursuit of the truth and the ability to speak so directly, regardless of any pushback that you get. I really admire that. And I guess maybe a good place to start is, one thing that I hear you talk about a lot is the idea of decentralized medicine. And as a health coach, a board certified health coach, I kind of feel like right now we're in this decentralized spot. And that's partially why I wanted to have a conversation with you. I see decentralized medicine, it does seem to be kind of set in its ways. So, can you talk a little bit about this idea of decentralized versus centralized medicine?
Yeah, I mean, it starts first where you have to define the term so people understand it. Centralized meaning that there's one central controller. Decentralized means that there's not one central controller. So, for example, nature is fully decentralized because it's based on light and dark cycles, and that makes the cycle of like circadian biology. Most people, I when I first started in this space 15, 20 years ago, I would have to fight with the paleo meatheads and everybody else about, that circadian biology was primary and food was, third or fourth on the list. But when I casually kept pointing out over and over and over again that, circadian biology trumps things. And then in 2016, the Nobel Prize is given for circadian biology. And all of a sudden, you could start seeing their paradigm, slowly slip away. Because if you think it's about food, this is a good place to start. Food would be more like a centralized controller, meaning that it's the only most important thing. It turns out it's not. And then when you actually break food down to its fundamentals, which I like to do, all food webs on Earth are broken down into photosynthesis. Like there's no food anywhere on this planet without photosynthesis. And you understand that photosynthesis is light rays from the sun in the visible spectrum slowed down when it hits chlorophyll. And when it gets slowed down, it turns light energy into mass. That's what food is. So when you parse those words out and break it down, food is effectively an electromagnetic barcode of sunlight. So what did we just say? Half of the story of nature is about food. The other half is about darkness. Now, to get into that, why that's important, that's a whole other topic. But to make the case about why decentralization and centralization is important, that's really the biologic perspective. In centralized medicine, the person who really is the central controller is the people that make the curriculums. In the United States and really in all Western countries, that's Big Pharma, because they subsidize the medical schools. They're germane in building the curriculums. And that construction idea goes all the way back to the Flexner Report, which was supported by, the Rockefeller Foundation and the original John Rockefeller when the government broke up Standard Oil. And this was, there's a lot of conspiracy theories around it, but one of the things, if you go back and read what Rockefeller had said in the beginning, that he would take it out of the government's hide for breaking up Standard Oil. And one of the ways he did that is he created Big Pharma from the, I don't want to say toxic waste chemicals, because not all of them are toxic, but the waste products from kerosene and oil manufacturing became what Big Pharma was based around. That's actually where we got the idea to fluoridate water. And it was usurped a little bit from John Snow, who most people probably know about the Broad Street fire hydrant, where people got their water in the mid 1850s in the UK. Then they had a cholera outbreak. And what did Snow do? He figured out it had to go back to the water, but he used chlorine. So how did we get to the use of fluoride or fluorine in Big Pharma? Most Big Pharma pills, like Floxin drugs and things like that, have these things in it. Well, that actually came from Rockefeller and all his chemists. And it turns out that fluoride and fluorine was a waste product. If many of the businesses that Rockefeller was in, and these were the businesses that Teddy Roosevelt broke up. So if you could make profit from your excrement, which is kind of what nature does. So I got to give Rockefeller some credit. He was actually thinking, the appropriate way. The problem is he never thought about the biologic effects, even though he wanted to take it out of the hide of the American government. He really harmed the public health more than anything else. And maybe, and I don't know this to be the case, maybe he never put two and two together and thought, well, the American populace is who votes for these idiots, so maybe I need to harm them. But I guess we can ascribe that to him, especially in terms of the actions of his children, his grandchildren, and his family, because effectively the modus operandi since 1911 for the people in the Rockefeller family has been to basically be one of the pillars that has formed centralized science. Those are the people that actually create the science that medical students learn about. And for my story, most of the people have kind of been recaptured since the Rick Rubin and Huberman podcast. When I told the story about the leptin melanocortin pathway, most people don't realize that Jeffrey Friedman is the one that discovered leptin, and it was done at Rockefeller University in New York in 1994. So the story that I just laid out for you, now I told you how it started, but realize some good things came of it. So from Rockefeller University, we found out about leptin, but now you're beginning to see how the story around leptin was buried and how it was re-engineered so that the cold receptors were then patented by, Big Pharma. Why? They don't want you to know that if you maximize light, water, and magnetism without a prescription pad, that you can do the same things as with a prescription pad. And in that podcast, I mentioned a disease because I want to give people I don't want people to think these are my ideas. What I am is I'm like a microphone or an amplifier of the things that are out there. And there's a disease called Krigler-Niger syndrome, which is a fatal disease. It's the one disease that we have now shown that we can use specific frequencies of light to fix this problem. So there was a pretty famous article written, at least in the biophysics world, by a lady named Tina Kruse, who's probably the world expert in infrared A light. And the title of the paper was, "Is Red Light a Proxy for Drugs?" And she wrote this beautiful article, laid the whole case out. And this was done in decentralized fashion, obviously, because that's what your question was about. And Tina Kruse, I guess, conclusion at the end of the paper is, in fact, it is, a drug therapy. So realize the gap between centralized and decentralized medicine. Centralized medicine is all about patenting drugs, okay? To patent things, there's legal ramifications of that. You cannot patent certain parts of light, especially you can't patent sun, which explains to you now why the sun has been demonized actually since Rockefeller's time. And this is the reason why the people that are tied to the centralized paradigm, like, for example, Bill Gates wants to bury the sun. It's also the reason why Bill Gates is buying farmland, because he realizes if you bury the sun, the food that he'll create will be more valuable. And it leaks into either other things in the food. Like we were just talking about this morning here in El Salvador, that when you have food down here, the way it tastes compared to the United States is different. Why? Because everything up there is GMO. There are certain things down here that are GMO. In fact, Hillary Clinton tried to spread that nonsense down here several years ago. And while I'm down here, I'm going to get a chance to talk to the Bukele administration about that issue, about if you're decentralized in your finance with Bitcoin, you also need to be decentralized in medicine and biology. So some of the things that were done in previous administrations here that were corrupt, these things need to change. And it's not like, the people who are running El Salvador don't know this. I mean, Bukele is like the George Washington of Central America, and he's returning freedom back to people. And this is the other flip side of decentralization that I think people need to understand. When we talk about decentralized finance, most people think shitcoins, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. It's really about Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is fully decentralized, meaning that there's no central controller, there's no central bank, and it was built that way by Satoshi Nakamoto to mimic what happens in circadian biology, but when there's a light and dark cycle. So for people who don't know that much about Bitcoin and don't know that much about my work, let me explain to you what the basis of decentralization is, so I can fully answer your question. Anything that is decentralized has to be based on proof of work. So for example, what's proof of work in biology? Proof of work in biology is the cow that I ate last night. It ate all the plants to become a cow so that I could eat it. In other words, it goes back to the circadian light and dark cycle. There is no central controller. In decentralized finance, which is what Bitcoin is, there is no central bank setting the rules of either inflation, deflation, hyperinflation. In other words, it's algorithmically set. And here's the irony for people who don't know anything about Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper that he wrote. I think 9 of all the footnotes in there are about time stamping. And what did I just tell you about biology? That biology is really about circadian timing. Why did I get into it with the carnivore and paleo meatheads 10, 15 years ago? Because they fundamentally believed it was about food and didn't understand that the time stamping of circadian biology trumps all of that. Well, Satoshi Nakamoto did the same thing with money. So the country that I'm in right now, the reason that I'm down here is they got the story right about money first. That was 3 years ago when they made Bitcoin legal tender here. What they're doing now, and Mike, you probably are going to be the only podcaster that gets this scoop first. But Kelly invited me down to a private event that's going to happen in mid-August here, where they want to learn how to decentralize science and medicine. And some of the people that are going to be at this event, these are names that people know. The leaders of Google will be here. The former leaders of Twitter will be here. There's going to be, big time money from Silicon Valley, from the United States, who now are beginning to realize the power of what Bitcoin can do, the power of what Lightning can do. But now we're going to take that switch that has already been turned on in El Salvador, and then we're going to put it to science and medicine. So I believe that the first institute for decentralized medicine will likely be somewhere in this country. And I think it will happen in the next 2 or 3 years. And do I believe that some of the thought leaders in Bitcoin who understand decentralization, who are pushing hard for this, like that's really what my friend Rick Rubin tried to do with Huberman, because Huberman's a centralized scientist and Rick is a decentralized patient of mine, and he knows that I'm a decentralized physician. And Rick is, as a creative guy, is trying to bridge the gap so that people like you and people like your audience begin to realize truly what decentralization means and why it's beneficial for the public health, because we have to begin to deconstruct the last 120 years of what Rockefeller built through the Flexner Report. We have to begin to realize why the randomized controlled clinical trial isn't the gold standard. It's the standard that was set by Newtonian physics, not by quantum mechanics. And that really, it blows people's minds when you talk about it. But fundamentally, the reason why this is important, Mike, is it goes back to timing. And I'm going to give you a little bit more, because I know I've been rambling on here about what decentralization is, but I don't think when I do podcasts, enough people give me enough leeway and runway to explain decentralization, like from its infant form to where I envision it going and where it is now. We have true decentralization in nature and Bitcoin. That's it. Bitcoin is the only one that's artificial. Nature is the only one that's the real deal. But they mimic each other. And with decentralization in medicine, when we get back to the core things that build our health, we actually get to subtract out the middlemen. How does this work in physics? I told you that proof of work is the sine qua non of decentralized networks. Proof of work in biology is photosynthesis. That's the QA program that we all need to aspire to. The same thing in us. You can look at your vitamin D proxies the same way. You can look at your mitochondrial heteroplasmy the same way. This is just like the time stamping that's done in the Bitcoin algorithm that fully decentralized, meaning that nobody can come in and fucking change the supply of Bitcoin. They can't do that. It's impossible to do without consensus from everybody that's part of the network. And that's actually what happens in nature as well. So proof of work is a huge, huge big deal. So the proof of work for us, where does it, is it based in physics? And this is going to shock people. But most physicists who listen to this, when you tweet this out, they'll know that I'm not bullshitting them. This is how fundamental or cornerstone the idea is. In a Newtonian world, that means 500 years ago, when Michelangelo was cruising around, time was believed to be absolute, okay? In other words, time didn't vary. That's what Newtonian physics is all about. But there was a problem with Newtonian physics that physicists began to realize. It couldn't explain everything that was observable in the ancient world, 500 years ago. So one of those examples was the perihelion of Mercury. Everybody knew that it was a problem. It didn't fit Newton's world. So a guy who was a little patent clerk in Switzerland, who happened to work around clocks and did a lot of thought experiments, came up with an idea. What if time wasn't absolute? What if time was relative? Then what did he do? He took pen to paper without ever doing an experiment. I want you to think about what I'm saying here. Compare this to randomized controlled trials now. Without ever doing an experiment, he writes the theory of relativity and the 4 papers from his miracle year without ever doing an experiment. And guess what we found out from that? Those are the laws of nature. They're axiomatically true. And if you remember what I said to Ruben in the podcast, I said, the laws of nature do not need a randomized controlled clinical trial. They're true on Andromeda, they're true on Jupiter, they're true on Earth, they're true in California, and they're true in El Salvador, no matter where it is. So when you understand that fundamental point, what are the implications of realizing that special and general relativity tell us that time isn't absolute? If time was absolute, randomized controlled clinical trials are the gold standard. That means cause and effect are real. But do you know what Einstein's general and special relativity really taught us in 1905? That time isn't absolute and there is no cause and effect. In fact, cause and effect is an illusion. And what's the consequence of that? That's Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, meaning everything is based on probability. Now, this is where Rockefeller's paradigm went off the rails. But the problem is nobody in 1905 or 1911 realized the implications of what Einstein really said. And I'm going to tell you, it's now 2023, and we still don't realize it. So guys like you, the kids that Huberman's teaching in Stanford Medical School, when I went through school, we always were taught that randomized controlled clinical trials were the sine qua non of centralized science. And they are. But that's based in a Newtonian world based on cause and effect, which is not true. So when you hear what I just said, and you know that I took it down to first principles, I'm very difficult to deal with. Why? Because then I can give you other reasons why the centralized paradigm science is a problem. For example, I told Huberman in his podcast, why don't I believe anything in centralized science anymore? Because everything in centralized science is done in a lab under blue light, right? So is that first principles? Did we evolve under blue light alone? No, we have 7 different frequencies, right, in different parts of the planet. And certain of those frequencies have to be present with other ones. That's not how things have been studied in the lab. So that means there's a lot of things masquerading as facts that are not facts. That is the consequence of centralized science. So why do you want to fully decentralize? Because of what I'm telling you right now. When you hear what I just said in the first 20 minutes of this podcast, it should be game, set, and match. Why should you decentralize your life across the board? Not just in science, not just in medicine, not just in finance. Because you need to understand how proof of work, timing, and how nature really works. And when you do that, you will become superhuman. Your consciousness will expand. You'll begin to do things you wouldn't do. If you ever thought that I'd be sitting here with my friend Jeremy Franco, this is the guy I met through Bitcoin in his country, and we're sitting at this beautiful location that we're at now, looking at the Pacific Ocean, hearing the waves crash, looking at palm trees with coconuts in them. You ever thought that this boy from New York City, who cruised through the Hall of Mammals to learn about the Archaeopteryx and how the T-Rex and how the mammals all tied together, that this confluence I ever saw coming? But you know what brought me to this point? Proof of work. I needed to find out why I was lost to those 18 months. Long ago when I read The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. That is the day that Jack became a decentralized scientist. That's when I became a decentralized doctor. I'm embarrassed to tell you, I made the same mistakes Huberman did for 20 years of my life. I believe that I harmed probably a lot of patients because of the things I was told. Now, did I know that? No, but just like a lawyer will tell you, ignorance is not a defense. So why, Mike, do I come on podcasts like this? And why do I fucking pound the table? And you can see my passion come through about this because I want everybody to know what I just said in the last 30 minutes. It's that important.
I agree. And I think one of the results of this centralized model is a type of dogmatism that kind of restrains some people's thinking to almost like a knee-jerk reaction, say, well, where are the clinical trials? Where are those randomized clinical trials? And even when I talk about your work on, I'm sorry?
They don't get it. They don't
right.
get it. Tell me about the clinical trial that we have for the photoelectric effect. It's a joke. I mean, it's fundamentally a joke. And when you understand that is how fundamentally light interacts with electrons, and we know it to be true, it's been tested literally millions of times. We don't need a randomized controlled clinical trial. You know what we need a randomized controlled clinical trial for? Is for dermatologists to explain why everybody gets skin cancer has low vitamin D levels. Because if they were really right about the sun, everybody that has a skin cancer should have a vitamin D level that's 200. But it turns out it's the opposite. So why don't we hold them to their own standards? You know why we don't? Because Rockefeller built a very powerful system that protects itself like a professional guild. Okay. And the word that you used before is dogmatic. I want to change it when we talk about science. You know what I want you to use from this point forward? Scientism. The guys like Richard Dawkins who want to get on the people who are religious, you don't realize that centralized science is another religion.
Right.
And it's a religion that is extremely profitable, much more profitable than the Jews, the Christians, or the Muslims. Far more. And it controls far more people, many more people. And the thing is, it hasn't led to the betterment. If you don't believe me, look at what our disease statistics are over the last 120 years.
Well, I think the pandemic too. The pandemic is a perfect example of what you're saying, how a lot of people failed to critically think. I mean, there are so many different instances between, hiding in your home away from the sun.
Fauci, in my opinion, Trump, the people in Congress, most of the central controllers in corporations that wanted everybody to comply, this is all the result of centralized science. I want people to realize that the reason I think time has come, not because I'm speaking the truth, it's because they got punched in the mouth by COVID. And they're starting to realize when you have something fundamentally wrong, the consequences or the implications, the collateral asymmetric non-effects. Think about what we did to all of our economies. Think about what we did to our lives. Think about what we did to our jobs. I can tell you, in my profession, COVID has absolutely shaken to the core. Why? Because now all the people that were on Twitter that said the messenger RNA vaccines were the greatest thing since sliced bread, and now we have LeBron James' son getting a cardiac arrest like DeMar Hamlin, or we have J.J. Watt having to retire because as an elite athlete that looks like Michelangelo's David, he goes into fulminant AFib and they couldn't even cardiovert. Look, the aftermarket data is clear. Centralized science has failed us, okay? And it's time, this is the key, Mike, it's time that the public realize, instead of questioning guys like me, they need to start questioning guys in Stanford University, in Harvard University, in Yale University, all the guys who control the NIH purse strings. We need to take people like Fauci, and we can argue whether we want to put him in jail, but you know what we need to do? We need to remove him from power, making decisions that harm people. Because, the last time I checked, Fauci has an MD like I do, and I took an oath that said do no harm. The difference between me and Fauci, I take it to heart. For him, I don't think he does. I think he's all about the profiteers of medicine. But here's the thing, and I said this to you before when we talked about Rockefeller. I think it goes down to the people. Look, if all of us get this message that we're delivering right now, we have the power. They don't have the power. We have to begin to stand up in every country in the world and tell these people, fuck you. Yep. We won't comply. The Danish farmers are doing it. Bukele is going to try to get those farmers to come here, give them land and say, make your food here. Do your proof of work here. That's what we want to do. We need other governments and politicians to do what Bukele's doing. Bukele is like the George Washington of Central America. I always tell people this story. I told Jeremy this. The United States is not defined by its border. It's defined by the ideas, and they're codified in our documents. Well, there's so much bullshit in mainstream media about Bukele that he's a dictator. What has he effectively done? He's done the exact same thing as our founding fathers. He's changed all his documents so that the people here have a great life. That these people now, this is like being in 1801 in the United States. And you're seeing it every time I come here, I see something different. He's changed it so that the people are getting the benefit. That is what proof of work in politics should be in our country. What am I starting to see? I would have never thought in a million years I would ever vote for a guy like RFK Jr. But his speech that he just gave in front of Congress before they interviewed him, he said, I want to say something. That was probably top 5 greatest speeches ever given by a politician. And you know what? This is a guy that I have a lot of problems with. I have some issues, but there's a lot of things that he says that I agree with. And the one thing I can tell you, I think as a leader, I don't think we would have made the mistakes that we made with Obama, with Hillary, with Trump, with the freaking idiot we have in now, Biden. I mean, it's preposterous. And I don't want to blame the leaders. I want to blame the people that voted for these people, because guess what? The fact that we elected a demented president, the fact that we've elected older people and not a younger person. The last person that we put in that was relatively young was JFK. And what happened? The industrial military complex took him out. Why? Because he was a danger to the centralized paradigm. So here we are now, post-COVID, talking about decentralization. And I want people to know that this doesn't just touch biology. This touches politics. It touches our money. It touches everything. And I want people to stop being obedient idiots. Like you said, I want people to begin to think critically about the things we're talking about, because this is not hyperbole. This is absolutely not hyperbole. It comes down, when you're going to get something good in life, just like your grandmother told you, you have to work for it. That's what proof of work is. Like, to get that coconut right there, it took all 7 spectrums of light to make that coconut from sunlight at the 13th north latitude. And I think the same thing is true with the way we do everything. You don't get to have a beautiful house built on the side of a cliff without a bunch of Salvadorians, bringing concrete up and mixing it up and doing that for money, which is also proof of work. Money should be proof of work. But guess what? Fiat currency isn't proof of work. Why? Because the centralized government can do what they did during COVID, print $6 trillion more, and our money's worth less, and we have inflation. And then we have an idiot president who's demented go out and tell everybody, oh, it's not from the money printing. I mean, this is the stuff that the voters, who are the voters in centralized medicine? The patients. When are you going to get sick and tired of being sick and tired by being told when you go to the doctor, here, take this fluoroquinolone antibiotic for your urinary tract infection, without ever getting told about the side effects, the black box warnings on these drugs? Or I don't want to just blame the primary care doctors now. Let me blame my own profession. As a neurosurgeon, I became aware that there was a problem with contrasted scans, with gadolinium. Why? Because it has effects. So because I was taught in residency, well, you want to use contrast for this case, that case. Now I do a double, a triple, a quadruple take before I recommend a contrasted scan. There's got to be a pretty damn good indication for me to do it. And do I actually disclose that through informed consent? Remember, I'm not the guy doing the MRI. I'm the guy reading it. It should be the radiologist doing this stuff, but rarely does that happen. Radiologists hardly ever talk to patients. They do sometimes, but very, very rare. And what is that a consequence of? It's a consequence of the centralized system, the way the system has been built. So can you really ever get true informed consent in a centralized system? That's one of the big messages behind RFK Jr. And he's right. He's totally right. But he came to this idea by being an environmental, lawyer and attorney, by seeing the problem from the other side. So I look at him now as me and him are looking at a diamond, and he's looking at a different facet than I am. But ultimately, when you look into the crystal, what are you getting back down to? You're seeing the problem of decentralization versus centralization. So your initial question, the whole half hour that we've blown on this, in my opinion, it's the single most important thing for people to understand about my work, about why decentralization is important, why decentralized medicine truly is something that everyone should strive for, we should vote for. In fact, I've made this comment before, probably on Instagram, but I've never said it publicly on a podcast. Might it be that health insurance is one of the biggest impediments to health?
Yeah. I agree completely, especially, I mentioned, I feel like health coaching right now is in a very decentralized state. A lot of us have the freedom to say things that might not be as welcome within centralized medicine. And I guess I do want to go back to around this idea of decentralization, just to play devil's advocate with Bitcoin. I'm sure you're familiar with OpenAI. and how Microsoft has kind of taken over what was intended to be a type of decentralized artificial intelligence. Now it's the total opposite. And one of my
Well,
fears about
I think I was going to tell you, just so you know, before you ask me this question, AI is
okay,
fully centralized.
hmm,
So I reject all things AI. And
yeah,
remember something. Remember what I just said to you, because Mike, well, I know we're talking to the audience, but really, when I do podcasts, I'm talking to you, right? I'm seeing you in this video. I just told you it's about proof of work. Tell me what the proof of work in AI is. There really is none. In fact, it's a way to skate around. So I look at AI as proof of stake. I look at it as a shitcoin. Okay.
okay,
It may have a usefulness for us, but if you think that I think we should replace nature with artificial intelligence, I am the anti Kurzweil. Nothing about his idea stands well with me. Why? Anybody who's fully decentralized begins to understand if you don't have proof of work at the core foundation of your programs, you have a huge issue. And you are quite correct in saying that the now Rockefeller companies, which is Microsoft, Google, Facebook, uh, Twitter, X, whatever the hell you want to call them, they're the problems.
hmm,
And they are now replacing what Rockefeller did. We're now to the next level, the industrial revolution. It's now a technology or information issue, and that brings up huge issues. How can information be absconded and centralized? You just answered it. It's already happened. It's gone. I mean, the guy, I forget his name. I know it's Sam something, but he runs OpenAI, the one that does the chat G.
yeah,
If you listen to what he says, every time he says something, it's centralized bullshit coming out of his mouth. But yet we have all these idiots on Twitter, saying, "Oh, AI is going to be great. AI is going to be great." I don't think AI is going to be great. I think AI is going to further the centralized paradigm. Why? Because it's just one monopoly enriching another. And when you actually think about it, that's actually what centralization is built on. It's about taking one monopoly to make the other one rich. This is the reason why Bill Gates went from computers, right, network computers. Now he's into vaccines, and now he's into food. Now he wants to block the sun. What is he doing? He's using his centralized paradigm that he built to take away decentralized networks from people and blind them to it. That's exactly what Rockefeller did.
yeah.
So it's no different.
Well, let me
So
play
I
devil's
reject your
advocate
premise.
again.
Reject your premise.
Well, so my concern really, I'm totally open to Bitcoin. It's really like when I hear names like Google being involved, or even like Larry Fink, I think his name is, from BlackRock, recently endorsed Bitcoin, said it's a good thing. I hear that, and that's a red flag for me. And I wonder, I understand what you're saying about how right now Bitcoin is very decentralized, but I wonder if there is potential for centralization. Surely people like Larry Fink must be trying to figure out
Just
how they can get
you
their
just saw,
hands on this.
Mike. You just saw the attempt to centralize Bitcoin just happened in the last cycle. That's what Sam Bankman-Fried and what
Mm,
Andreessen Horowitz tried to do. That was the eight there's 16 guys. They tried to use crypto, non-Bitcoin, to abscond what Satoshi Nakamoto built. Here's the real issue. It's impossible to do. Why? Because you saw what happened. I mean, we got to the point where SBF was going to go to the politicians and get special dispensation for all the shitcoins. What is a shitcoin? A shitcoin is just like fiat money. It can be
yeah,
rehypothecated. They did try to rehypothecate Bitcoin. You saw what happened. All of the people that did it got taken to the woodshed. See, that's what nature does. If people forget what the modus operandi of nature is, everybody thinks they should get a trophy in third grade. Well, it's funny. We have 5 extinction events. And when things get really bad in a decentralized world, what happens? Things get taken to the woodshed. You just saw extinction event for decentralized finance, non-Bitcoin. That's called crypto. That's called shitcoins. These are all synonyms of the same problem. Now, the reason, and this is where I would get you on track, the reason why BlackRock is in the reason why Fidelity's in, the reason why Schwab is in now, it's not because they're trying to abscond the process. They know that money is going by the wayside. What's the next step for centralized money? It's called the central bank digital coin. You know what the problem with the central bank digital coin is in the United States? That's what the Fed now system is, effectively now. But you know what the real problem is? This is probably the single best thing that Trump did in his presidency. The court is now 6-3 on most things that are going to be tied to decentralization. One of the amendments in our Constitution makes the CBDC unconstitutional. Now, guess what? They never want to bring that. They could have absconded that if they had to have a court that was more progressive. In other words, then I think your question held some face validity. Right now, the only captured, or I should say non-captured part of the U.S. government, in my opinion, is the Supreme Court. Even parts of it are captured. But when it comes to a CBDC, it will not be the next step that will be easily adopted. But what is already here since 2011? Bitcoin. The problem for the government with Bitcoin is they know they can't control it. So what are they attempting to do right now? They're attempting to control the on and off ramps. Okay? You can't control it, but you can control access to it. So that means how banks interact. Like, I don't know if you saw Twitter last couple of days. I kind of laughed at this. Joe Mercola was on there bitching and moaning that Chase deplatformed him, his CFO, his CEO. You want to know what I said? I'm sure people will be totally pissed off by this. I said, good for that fucker. You know why? Because he's selling centralized supplements. He's making the same mistake in biology. So now he's getting bit by the same hand, and he doesn't realize if he was smart, his money would have already been in decentralized networks like Lightning and Bitcoin. But they weren't. And he doesn't even realize that here he's trying to be an alternative to centralized science, but he doesn't understand the story in money. And I got news to you. Guys like Jamie Dimon, they are going to protect their franchise till their dying day. Same thing with BlackRock. They now know that they can't screw with Bitcoin. So when you get to that point, you join the party. See, Mike, that's the difference. You need to have a little bit in there because how does currency usually fail in history? Almost always fails in hyperinflation. It doesn't fail in deflation. Can it? Sure, it can. But if you look at history, it's pretty obvious. How do you get inflation or hyperinflation? It's very simple. You rehypothecate the money supply. In other words, you expand it. When you expand it, the money's worth less. So let's go back to our decentralized idea. At the time of Rockefeller in 1911, when the Flexner Report came out, you know that $1 is now worth 98.9% less. So $1 in 1911 is now worth about 1 cent. That is the effect of normal centralization from the central bank. Because remember, when the central bank came up, 1911, that's the creature of Jekyll Island. These things, the things that you're talking about, decentralized medicine and decentralized finance, began in the beginning of the 20th century, after World War I. This idea came there. It came from the people that had Standard Oil, the monopolies of the day, biggest monopolies in the world. How can we live in a non-monopoly world? They've said, let's build centralized paradigms. In other words, what people don't even realize today, slaves are black, white, Spanish, Chinese, and they live in countries like Australia, Canada, and the United States. But they're economic slaves. They don't realize that we're still the slaves on the plantation because guess what? The masters are sitting in Washington, D.C., giving us rules that they don't follow. Look at John Kerry. That's what the climate scam is all about. These are all centralized ideas to control us, to make us like cattle so that we'll pick their cotton for them. And we'll do it with a smile on our face. Guess what? Things like nature, things like Bitcoin are opt-out cards. These are non-compliance tests. These are the things that Gandhi would have been behind. These are the things that JFK would have been behind. These are the things that our founding fathers would have been behind. And the saddest part, who is the guy in decentralized medicine that we should all be talking about? Benjamin Rush of Rush Medical School. He petitioned Thomas Jefferson, before the Declaration of Independence was written, before the Constitution was written, to put medical tyranny in both documents. And do you know why it didn't make it? Because the founding fathers could not imagine any scenario where that would be operational. And that's the reason it was left out. And guess what happened? Thomas Jefferson was right until Fauci, Biden, Trump, Birx, Redfield, all the people at the World Economic Forum, all the people at the World Health Organization decided to use the centralized science to make us controllable. That's what COVID was. COVID was an economic compliance test to change the world to benefit the slave owners so that the slaves stayed compliant and did the things that we did, so that we grow their food, so that we pick their cotton, so that we go to work every day, so that we do the things they want us to do, so that their lives, so they can fly around like King Charles and John Kerry in their fucking planes with diesel fuel and have rules that we'll have carbon credits, but they'll just buy our stuff because they control all the money. This is the reason why decentralization is important to the common man, to the slave. Look, I'm a neurosurgeon. I have money, but I got news for you. I'm a fucking slave. Don't get it wrong. I was a slave as a centralized doctor. The reason I'm passionate about this stuff, I want people to understand we are our own biggest enemies. We vote for these idiots. It goes all the way back to the ancient story of Plato and the allegory of the cave. We are putting our wrists out like this and say, put the handcuffs on us when we comply with what a centralized paradigm wants us to do. That means whether it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, whether it's in the New York Times, whether it's from Chase Manhattan deplatforming us, no matter what it is, my friend, any place where the centralized paradigm slips it in you, you need to fight against it. You need to fight vehemently against it and don't feel bad about it. You need to be just like the Pilgrims were when they came over and they told King George, you can kiss our ass. We're gonna worship God the way we want, and we're not paying taxes the way you want us to do. Okay? Now it's about medical freedom. It's about making choices. Like, the government has no role, in my opinion, in a decentralized framework to tell us how to run our health.
Yeah.
We need to do it by using nature. Now, many of us don't realize that. Many of you still think taking blood pressure medication is more wise than coming out here to the 13th latitude and making nitric oxide from the sun behind us. That's fine. But my goal is to teach you that as the decentralized physician, why that's a bad idea. That's my goal in this. I'll get to that later. But what Mike has asked me about for the first 45 minutes of this podcast, why decentralization matters. If you don't get it after these 45 minutes, you never will.
Sure. And one of the things that summarizes, kind of shifting into the health aspect of things, one of the things that has summarized your philosophy, as you put it, is live like a polar bear, eat like a shark. And I think that logic, part of that logic is, well, the food isn't as important, the exercise isn't important. And I think one way to sort of frame that is a lot of people are doing so-called healthy things in an unhealthy environment. And it really makes so much sense when you really look into the weeds. Many people don't like to look into the weeds. They like to read the headlines. And I think part of that is this centralized model. Part of it is the propaganda machine that is the World Health Organization. I mean, by definition, all they do is propaganda. They propagate messages to shape the opinions and behaviors of the public. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. But the one thing I did want to ask you, going back to Biden now, the Biden administration has openly said, we want to block out the sun. This is thanks to Bill Gates, who's been talking about this for at least 5 years, I think. But on the other side of the world, you have China that has invented an artificial sun. I would assume that Bill Gates has had a hand in that too. I don't know. But again, playing devil's advocate here, in a theoretical sense, could an artificial sun address the concerns of blocking out the actual sun? Could this ever work?
Let's put it this way. Based on the physics that we know, how light is actually created, the answer is no. Now, do I hold open the possibility, just like any good scientist would, that you have to suspend your belief when somebody comes up with something that can do it? I'm open to the idea, but I'm going to tell you right now, technology wise, where we are now, we are nowhere close to be able to model the sun, especially the light of the sun. Uh, the light of the sun is very, very complex. It has some very unique capabilities, and life on this planet for 4.6 billion years is optimized to terrestrial sunlight. The fact that man is so arrogant to think that they can recapitulate nature in a couple of centuries is almost comical, and it highlights the whole Dunning-Kruger effect, that you have to understand the implications of being wrong. Like, we just went through COVID, which was perfect example of centralized science gone horribly wrong because you didn't think about the consequences of the decision tree. Can you imagine the mistakes that would be made from blocking the sun and using an artificial sun? I mean, I just think that when most of the westernized world gets to that point, I think that's when you need to opt out and come to a place like this. And to be honest with you, I'm already at that point. Why? I don't have a lot of faith in the system, but I would tell you that I am beginning to get a lot of faith in the people. Why? I think the reason that we have guys like RFK Jr. right now, the reason why we have guys like Jack Dorsey, who said, you know what, I'm done with my board at Twitter. They've absconded my power to try to build a decentralized network. I'm going to go focus 100% on doing things my way. And the fact that he sold it to Elon Musk, I think, is kind of ironic because he's a guy that's caught between two worlds. He understands the decentralized world because he is an engineer, but he is addicted to centralized systems. Why? Because they've enriched him beyond belief. And the thing is, when you look at people at their core, how they run themselves, what they believe, I don't hold people accountable for what they used to believe. Believe me, I told Huberman this on the podcast. I was just like him. I believed the same things he did. And I think that still is what fuels my passion. I'm madder than hell that somebody was able to, steal my brain on cruise control or USB upload because I believed the bullshit for too long. I feel the same way about voters now. I'm not going to pound on people because they voted for Trump or they voted for Biden, but I want them to realize that whether you voted for Trump or you voted for Biden, you still voted for a problem. And the thing is, it's a centralized problem. We need to begin to vote for people. We're going to turn the world back to the way it was in the beginning, where no one controls anyone, where we listen to everybody's opinion, and then we decide, okay, as a country, we're going to do this. That's not what we have in the United States anymore. It's actually not what we have really anywhere in any system of government. I don't think the perfect union is here yet. I think people need to realize that probably the best way to do it comes down to zip codes. What's best for people here in El Zante and El Salvador is probably radically different than what's best for people on 55th Street and Madison Avenue. But realize that there's a biologic toll to pay for living that way. There's also a biologic toll for living in a place like this. And then it's ultimately up to you to decide how you want to live your life and what you want to do. The big thing is how should healthcare be compensated for? I believe it's got to be precision N=1 medicine, where the single most important thing that I can do for people is to teach them about nature and how it interfaces with biology that is actually in their centralized books. I think I've done that pretty well over the first probably 10 or 15 years. The thing that I'm doing now that's a little bit different is getting people to understand how those systems can integrate. For example, you're always going to need centralized doctors that have the information I have. I don't pound on us tremendously because you get a subdural and epidural, you break your leg, you need those doctors to fix that acute problem. That's something that we're excellent at doing. That's something the centralized system should be proud of. But it's the things that we're bad at, which is the chronic disease. And it turns out that's our biggest problem in healthcare today. So why should we pat ourselves on the back about the things we do good? I mean, it's kind of like why we have good and bad. We have good and bad so that we can learn from each one. And you have to learn from your failures. And I think what I'm fundamentally trying to get across to you in this podcast is that the centralized system is built to minimize our fails. In fact, we keep spending money on the wrong things, and we're not getting the return on equity we need. And it's going to take people voting to realize, hey, maybe we need to start thinking about the way we deal with things a little bit different in medicine. But patients have to begin to opt out. It's incredible to me that people will say, well, no, I only want to go to the doctor, but I'm only willing to pay a $5 or $10 copay. And all you're going to get from a $5 or $10 copay is a 5-minute visit, a prescription for, I don't know, Synthroid, and never get told how the leptin melanocortin pathway actually interacts with this disease so that there's a process for you to reverse it. That's never going to happen in that system. And you have to realize as the patient, you know what? I don't want to remain sick. I remember every time we cure a disease in a centralized system, we eliminate a customer. That's the reason why.
Yes.
That's the reason why I'm a problem for the centralized system. But I'm trying to tell the centralized system right now that you can still have a good healthcare system doing it the way I've been doing it for 15 or 20 years. Why? Because there's a huge amount of benefit in getting people who are ill healthy so that they're back to a productive state for society. So then we can do other things. And the return on equity from health comes in other places. This is the reason why I've taught my members that health and wealth are fundamentally linked. And they're really linked in a decentralized network, which is part of the reason why, 3-4 years ago, Mike, my member event, I actually taught my members about Bitcoin. I said, look, you guys need to start thinking about this, because I fundamentally believe if things continue to go, and this is pre-pandemic now, if things continue to go the way they're going, I believe that our government is going to begin to do things that really harm our health and our wealth so that you'll never be able to have enough money to pick up and go someplace like this. And you'll be a slave to your plantation, which you call a house. And you'll falsely have the belief that your house is worth $1 million when it's really not. It's only worth $200,000, but you think it's worth that much because the money is devalued. But yet, you'll have the false sense in your head that I'm rich. And that's exactly what the centralized paradigm wants you to do. So they know that you can't go anywhere. So like I just left Europe. One of my members there, Johan, he's from Norway. He told me that most of the people in Norway, even though it's a fairly wealthy country because they have a lot of oil, they pay 5 times their normal salary just to own a house. That is slavery. That is economic slavery through your house. But the thing is, people don't look at it like that. And I think that's the problem, where you have to get people to understand the way you want to be is you want to be a wild animal that can make it in nature, shelter your family, educate them the proper way, make sure that they have the things that they can have to allow them to thrive, not just survive. Because I think centralized systems are built to allow for people to have basic survival. That's it. And no one should be okay with just survival. No one. If you want to thrive, you need to be fully decentralized. And really, that's kind of what evolution does. That's what the whole point of, survival of the fittest. I've told my members that survival of the fittest really is one of Darwin's poorest ideas that centralized science has stolen. The most important part of survival of the fittest is conditions of existence. And my vernacular that I teach in mitochondrial medicine, it's actually survival of the wisest that's the most important part in today's world. For the reasons you said earlier about guys who think it's a good idea to go out and eat, say a ketogenic diet, but yet work out in the blue lit gym. Because our environment has changed so much, people don't realize that as the environment varies, so does your biology. And you have to be smart enough and facile enough to say, okay, what is the single most important determinant of my health? And it's going to turn out it's the environment that you're in. That's what sculpts the thermodynamics of your mitochondria. That's actually what turns on and turns off your genes. It's not the genes that do it. The centralized paradigm has had us believe since 1953 that we're all about genes. We're all about RNA, DNA, tRNA. And it turns out that's not true. It's actually the mitochondrial DNA that actually is the software that controls the hardware. And because of that one big misstep in centralized science, that's the reason we got all these chronic diseases. That's the reason why modern medicine is terrible at chronic disease management. You can trace it all the way back when you become a decentralized medicine detective and go right back there and realize that 99% of the NIH budget is spent on the nuclear DNA. Less than 1% is spent on the mitochondrial DNA. That is exactly why we're spinning our wheels.
Hey, listen up. I know interruptions are annoying, but I'm not here to plug somebody else's business. There's no sponsorships here at this podcast, at least not right now. So please just give me 60 seconds. Hear me out. Of course, my podcast here is the Healthy and Awake podcast, but my business is called Red Pill Health and Wellness. And what I am all about is talking about propaganda and influence and the way that a lot of institutions and organizations like to pull our strings and get us to act in ways that we didn't exactly think of on our own. They're kind of just plugged into us from these people pulling our strings and pushing our buttons. So I do spend a lot of time talking about that, but where I am really helpful and where my business is really helpful is we teach people about these tactics so that they can prevent themselves from being influenced by others, but even more importantly, how we can leverage those same influence tactics so that we can accomplish our goals around health. And quite frankly, the same tactics go beyond health. You can use these tactics to make money and improve your life in other ways and all sorts of things. So I offer a specific system within my program, the Red Pill Your Health program, so that you can keep working on your goals beyond the 4-month program, or maybe you want to do one-on-one. But I offer a specific system so that you can, without fail, implement your goals in a sustainable way, basically for the rest of your life. I offer you tools that you will always have at your disposal, tools that are personal and individualized to you and you specifically. So please check out my website. MikeVera.com is probably the easiest place to go to see my business and the program, but the official website is redpillhealthandwellness.com. MikeVera.com will just take you there. It's shorter. It's easier to remember. So that's it. Let's get back to the show. It seems kind of crazy that circadian health is something we know about. I mean, there's plenty of research on this. And in the health and wellness space, we spend so little time talking about it. And I've done my own type of research.
I'm going to tell you something, though, Mike. You got to caveat this because I like pounding on centralized things, but I got to give them one pass here. When I went through medical school, I learned about the basic components of the circadian mechanism, but we didn't know shit about them. I'm going to tell you, the last 25 years, that's actually when we've now begin to figure out truly how the system works. And I will tell you, the implications of how that system works is the reason why these chronic diseases are showing up. And truth be told, those implications haven't hit the textbooks yet. Not even the PhD researchers who are involved in this. Like, I don't want to throw them under the bus again, but I'm gonna. It's one of the things I said to Huberman in the podcast, and I want you to think about what I'm saying here. Do you remember the story when he told me about one of his friends who found out about Melanopsin? He goes, "Isn't it crazy that we have amphibian and fish opsin in our body? And isn't that nuts?" And I chuckled during the podcast, and I said, "Why did you guys find this amazing?" Because you realize that mammals 300 million years ago came from amphibians and fish. Like, that's the evolutionary trajectory. So why wouldn't we have it? The fact is, when you make that basic a mistake, then you begin to realize why they don't understand why the non-visual photoreceptive system in mammals is more important than the rods and cones in the eye. See, we have focused for so long on that, and this gets back to your question. There's plenty of stuff in the literature right now, but Mike, the problem is you can have things printed, but if you don't make the connections, it's kind of like what Einstein did for physics. Physics was at a place before Einstein where they were stumped by something called the ultraviolet catastrophe. Einstein solved for X. Why? Because he brought other things to the table that we didn't realize. And the crazy thing is he did it without experiment. And I guess what I'm trying to tell you now is circadian biology is going to do the same thing that Einstein did for medicine. It's going to have the exact same effect, because when you realize that it is about light and dark cycles, and you realize that light is the most complex thing on this planet, you immediately begin to realize that there are so many things that are built into our physiology that are light-based that we still don't understand well enough. Then you'll begin to understand, Mike, why the centralized paradigm is so bad. I think we're in inning one of this story. And my point is, the fact that it's published and we know about it's great, but we now need to spend money, 99% on the mitochondrial DNA and the circadian side, and very little stuff on the nuclear side that comes from Watson and Crick. You know why we're not doing that? The centralized science paradigm was built around the nuclear DNA story. That immediately Rockefeller and all his cronies said, we are going to control this information so that it's a benefit for us. Therein lies the problem. And guess what? The government doesn't realize that Rockefeller's initial promise to Congress at that time, that I will take this out of your ass and bankrupt you, that's exactly what's happening. And the thing is, people don't see it for what it is, but here's the ultimate thing. Our tax dollars are going towards funding what we study. If people, stop focusing on abortion and maybe start focusing on where we're spending our research dollars, we may never get to the point where we have a monster like Fauci make decisions for all of us because he thinks he knows the science, or he is the science. I view him on the same order as the medicine doctors that were involved with the Nazis. And a lot of people think that's hyperbole. I think it's terrible to say that. I don't. I think more people have been killed in the last 3 years than have been killed in all the wars in the 20th and 21st centuries. And it was done for no good reason at all. Really, it was done to enrich the guys that originally came from Rockefeller's regime. He got his money back. I promise you, he got his money back from breaking up Standard Oil. But it's time that us, the slaves, get together and realize the game that's really being played right in front of our faces, but none of us see it. And the way for you to do that is to embrace light, water, magnetism, mitochondrial biology, learn like what decentralized medicine teaches. We teach you the wisdom that's buried in nature so that you can live a life not being tethered to the sausage maker. You're not going to be the piece of steak that gets fed through the system so you get hurt. You're going to begin to realize that it's not crazy to go out and lift heavy things, but do it outside in nature. Just don't do it in a blue lit gym. It's not crazy, to say I'm not going to eat a banana when I live in Boston on December 31st because photosynthesis doesn't grow it there. I mean, you have to realize 15 years ago at the PaleoFX conference, I got into it with a Harvard-trained psychologist, or I should say psychiatrist, Emily Deans, who blocked me soon after that on social media because I told the world she's a fucking idiot. Why? And to this very day, she thinks that she is somehow more evolved in her thinking because it was about food for her. Little did she know the Nobel Prize would come out in 2016, 2017. Some of the people at Harvard University where she worked were germane in pushing that agenda further. And this is one of the brilliant points that I think Huberman made. A problem in centralized science is that everybody's in their own silo. And there's not a lot of cross-pollination. One of the things that you're going to learn about me, I'm that guy who breaks out of silos. My roots go everywhere. I go to science and different areas. Anything that makes sense from a decentralized perspective, I want to know about it. I may not know how it fits into the broader theory yet. Like, I'll give you an example. Neutrinos. Neutrinos are a perfect decentralized idea. Why? I'll pose this to you. Neutrinos are the number one particle made from a star. Do you think nature would have no use for the number one particle created from a star? Right. Nature doesn't make mistakes. You know what our problem is? Us as humans haven't figured out what the hell neutrinos are really doing. But I promise you, it's going to turn out to be one of the biggest stories probably in the next 100, 200 years when we get, down to the brass tacks. But that's the point that I'm trying to say to you, that that's what Einstein did. Einstein looked at time and said, what if time isn't absolute? And what are the implications of not absolute? What did I say to you here? What if nuclear DNA isn't the big thing? What if it is mitochondrial DNA? What are the implications for us? Is that the message that I'm getting ready to deliver to the Bukele, administration? Because guess what? They made mistakes. They jumped on the WHO bandwagon. But just as I told you before, I'm not worried about the mistakes you made in the past. You know what I'm concerned about? What did you do with the failure? Was the failure used positively to move humanity in a positive direction through a decentralized pathway? If you do that, then Uncle Jack's not going to ride your train. But, when you post a tweet that you got deplatformed by Jamie Dimon and bitch and moan about that and don't realize that you don't know shit about biology and you also clearly don't know shit about money, I think Joe Mercola got the prescription he deserved.
It was surprising to see what happened with Dr. Mercola because, I mean, I've been following him too, and he talks a lot about the Rockefellers and Bill Gates, and I was thinking, like, how were you not expecting that? But
because Guess what?
What's that?
He's part of the centralized paradigm as well. Remember, I always say this, and this is what pisses a lot of people off. It's okay to go after allopathic medicine, the Rockefellers, but just realize functional medicine and the Joe Mercolas are doing exactly the same thing. They're doing it with labs and they're doing it with supplements. Okay? And because they're an alternative to a centralized paradigm, that doesn't mean they're not decentralized. Actually, they're centralized too. So what do you find when you jump down that rabbit hole? I got some people here with me right now that'll tell you they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on labs and treatments and chelation therapies and all this. And guess what happened? Nada. Again, what did I say to you? Mike, don't forget this. This is the take home of this podcast. If it doesn't have proof of work at its basis, you should reject it. And that's the reason why. The same way that I feel about King George, the same way I feel about Rockefeller, the same way I feel about Big Pharma is the same way that I feel about probably Joe Mercola, Dave Asprey, Mark Sisson, Rob Wolf, Emily Deans, anybody else that's out there that I view as centralized and not proof of work, because they haven't done the work of thinking about how light, water, and magnetism really operates in cells. That's all I'm trying to do. Doesn't mean that I dislike these people. I can tell you, I don't dislike Joe. I don't dislike Mark. I don't dislike Rob. But I have been fighting them just like I've been fighting the centralized paradigm, because they don't even realize they're in their own centralized dogma. And until they realize what I showed you in the beginning, light and dark cycles, bro. This is predator and prey. They have to be coupled. And when you do this, that's when chaos results. And until you get to understand how, when things fall apart, they lead to the chronic diseases through problems with mitochondrial DNA, you are part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I will continue to call you out constantly about this. Why? My job as the decentralized physician is to teach guys like you and the public the truth. I don't care what any of you think about me. I want to make sure that I right the wrongs of my previous life when I was fully centralized. I'm now leading you down the pathway where I know you can get better. I know that you can be the best version of yourself when you understand it. Doesn't mean that you're not going to need a doctor when you break your leg because you're climbing up some lava tube here in El Salvador, or you hit your head on the rocks when you're surfing. That's not what it means. And unfortunately, that's what the idiots on Twitter think it means. And it's not. It's a mechanism of critical thinking that you get to first principles. How are we built? What are the physics of organisms? And when you look at it, you'll find out it comes basically down, always proof of work. And then it'll dawn on you one day. That's what Jack's been saying the whole time about decentralized networks. Everything. Bacteria work this way. archaea work this way, eukaryotes work this way. There's no domain in nature that doesn't. Nature is fully decentralized. Every day I wake up and I get another decentralized lesson. Like this morning, Frida and I were in the pool, the sun came up, and all of a sudden you hear all the old T-Rexes chirping. And as they came up, I was like, this is just amazing. This story has been going on the surface of the planet for 300 million years. And we still see it today. That song is still being played today. And you know what the crazy part is? Mammals, eukaryotes, are now ignoring that message. They're now being told that the sun is toxic. The dermatologists and ophthalmologists that were schooled by Rockefeller's paradigm are telling people that, and they're actually believing it. Look at the people in Australia on the side of the buses. Put sunscreen on. Make your kids wear sunglasses. I mean, that message, that will keep you a prisoner. You will absolutely never break free until you begin to question everything. Everything you've been told. Break it down. If it goes back down to proof of work, then guess what? Then that is the truth, and you can put that in the bag of tricks. I don't need to go down that road anymore. I got it. But anything that doesn't fit that, you need to continue to search. You have to keep going. You have to push the envelope. And don't be afraid about it. Be actually proud that you have this unbelievable quantum computer in your head that allows you to continue to search for the truth. It is the most fun thing you can do in your life. You become passionate about doing it. You see it in everything you look at. I'm standing here now in front of gorgeous scenery talking to you, and I think to myself, how fucking stupid was it that I went, to the Arctic Circle 2 weeks ago when I could have been doing this for 3 extra more weeks, And the thing is, I know there was a purpose of me going up there. Why? Because the message needed to get up there too. I needed to talk to the people up there too. And my friends like Rick Rubin, he's actually kind of turned the switch on me. If it wasn't for him in March of this year, I think I would have stayed in my hole. Why? Because the people that tried to put me in the hole and cancel me 20 years ago, I think maybe they were successful in a certain way. Now I feel like I'm uncaged. I'm probably madder than hell than I've ever been before. And I'm not going to hold my tongue. My mouth is not a bakery. I want people to know the truth. But the problem is people think that I really care what they think about me. I don't. You know what I care about? I care about that people get the right message. I want them to be wise mammals. Humans have this brain in their head that allows them to do amazing things, but they're wasting it. They're totally wasting it. And we got to stop doing that. And it's really of our own doing. We're letting our frontal lobes get in the way of the truth.
Wow, I have so many questions. I don't even know where to go next. I guess, you did mention hospitals and the lighting environment earlier. You had mentioned that. And, this is something I think about a lot because my dad's a neonatologist. He spends a lot of time in the hospital, as you do. And crazy hours, babies being born at 3 a.m. It's disruptive to health on just about every level, it seems, with the EMF, the disrupted sleep, the lighting. So this is kind of a silly question, but if you had like a magic wand and you could change things about hospitals today to make them exactly in this paradigm, fit in your image in this way, what would a future hospital look like?
Simple. You're going to be surprised. This is not a silly question. This is probably the most brilliant question that you asked me. Casement windows, like they have in Germany and Europe. The windows that open up so the nurses can just go like this. The windows open up and invite the sun in. That's it. How much would that cost us, Frida? Frida's in construction. How much? Not much. A lot less than some of the shit that we wasted money on. So just so you know, Frida builds NFL stadiums. So she knows a little bit about something like this. So
that's cool.
Casement windows is where I'd start. Right. Nano walls, those are retractable things that Frida puts into NFL suites for rich people, so you can open it up. Okay. Second or third thing, I would put in systems of water to get rid of deuterium, to lower deuterium. So every hospital would run on deuterium depleted water. Every recovery area for any patient, whether it's the ICU, PACU, ICU, like the place where your dad works in the PICU, all of them would have openings to put the kids in nature. All of their incubators your dad works with, I'd have the top layer or the side layers made out of quartz so that when you do put them in there, they can do it. You can still make the plastic openings that the nurses go through made out of plastic, so it's cheap. But let's make all incubators out of quartz. That way, light comes through that we're bringing in from the casement windows work. Okay? Why is that important? Because most of those kids that your dad deals with, they're all intubated. What people don't realize is that UV light, when it's married with IR light, increases venous O2. So guess what? We actually are effectively giving these kids more oxygenation just by changing the external environment that we put them in. Putting a kid in an incubator is like Sean Baker going and working out in the blue lit gym. Or my friend who's now dead, Charles Poliquin, going in to a blue light gym to hypertrophy his heart and kill himself. It's exactly the same problem. But you know what the problem is? People don't look at it the way I look at it.
Yeah.
So your question, how do we change hospitals? In fact, this is the things that I'll probably talk to Bukele about. When you build your hospital, these are the things that you need to think about. Don't build the stupid things like hospital systems built now that is, useless waste of square footage. Make it so that they're all optimized to health. Probably the fourth thing I would do, because I got to make some of the food people happy here, I would fire every dietitian in the United States, and I would make the dietitian in every hospital look at the latitude and the longitude and go talk to the farmer, find out what grows there, and that's what would be on the menu for the people at that hospital. It would be based on photosynthesis 100%. In other words, my QA program would not be a nutritionist, a dietitian, or some fucking idiot pharmacist. It would be photosynthetic. How's that for my top 4?
So you don't like the cafeteria food, the chicken nuggets and French fries at the hospital?
No.
I do have
nothing gets processed. That's all centralized food.
Yeah, definitely. This is another, I'm not super familiar with like the real nitty gritty details of these types of terms. So please bear with me. But my understanding about the effects of blue light is that there's a pathway in the eye that goes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which is a big reason that the blue light itself can be disruptive. Like through that pathway, it can start to cause different kinds of problems. And I guess I'm wondering, we know there's photoreceptors in the skin that can similarly be affected by blue light, but it seems to be not as strong. I'm guessing because there is no direct pathway to the suprachiasmatic nucleus through the skin. Whether or not that's true, my question is, you see me wearing these glasses. Would something like a face mask, just like they did during the pandemic, would that, like a blue light blocking face mask, would that have a stronger effect, or would that kind of be overkill?
It would have a stronger effect because you do have melanopsin in your skin. But just so we get this right, probably there's going to be a lot of people that are glad that you went down this path. What you need to know, the pathway on your skin is direct. What makes it direct? What's the most common biologic chemical in your body? Water. The melanopsin system works through hydrogen bonding networks everywhere in your body. That's the reason why it's so powerful. Dr. Huberman did a really good service during our podcast, although we didn't spend time on it. The number one opsin in the human brain and the human skin is melanopsin. So you got to ask yourself a question. Why is it that nature put a blue light detector everywhere in our body? Then you got to ask yourself, what's the effect of us creating a blue light world? Okay. Then all of a sudden you begin to see where the problem comes. So the pathway that you need to know comes through the eye, hits something called the RPE in the eye. It's a retinal pigmentum epithelium. That's the first place that melanin's at. Turns out that the melanopsin system is in the inferior nasal part of the retina. Then it projects to the SCN and it goes to a place in the thalamus called the habenular nucleus. That controls mood. So those are two places where the light pathway is direct in the brain. Both of these are diencephalic derivatives, okay, from the embryo. So this tells you these are primitive pathways in all mammals, but they also extend to almost everything that's alive on this planet. So it tells you that this is an ancient, ancient system. We're talking 650 million year old system when complex life formed. So that's the reason it's important. Now, where it begins to change is, which is what I tried to tell Huberman, the pathway in humans goes the retinal hypothalamic pathway, which is that RPE, to the SCN. The SCN goes to the PVN, which is the paraventricular nucleus, goes then to something called the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. That's where all the sleep pathways are. Then it radiates out through the whole spinal cord and all the things there. If you understand this one pathway of melanopsin, you can pretty much describe every single chronic disease that man is afflicted by. Now, do you need to understand how the non-visual photoreceptor system interacts with some of the things that centralized medicine talks about? Like, for example, most people are stunned to find out that the number one non-visual photoreceptor in man is cholesterol. No one gets told that. No one understands truly what the difference between HDL and LDL cholesterol is. The answer is electrons. Oh, we're back to the guy in Bird, photoelectric effect. And it turns out that the non-visual photoreceptor system varies by the environment that you're in, the light environment you're in, which is the reason why I told you conditions of existence are far more important than any of the Darwinists really understand. And it's also the reason why the centralized system focuses in on the wrong thing, which is natural selection. That's the path to where we are now in centralized science. So once you understand how light controls our biology, and I just gave you a basic framework for the system you asked me about, which is melanopsin. The system through the eye is very direct. So if you think about the eye, the way I want you to think about it as a decentralized clinician, the eye is the on and off switch for the brain. Turns out your skin is also an on and off switch for your brain, because what is the skin? The skin is the solar panel for the accessory two lobes right here, the frontal lobes. The difference between us and chimps is, remember, our skin is covered with hair, but it's hair that allows the sun to go through. Chimps have a lot of hair. The amount of light they're getting through their surface isn't as great as what we get. That's the reason we lost the hair, so that we could give energy to these two extra lobes. If you look at a chimp's face, that's the reason why it's flat. It's the reason why they're born different. It's the reason why, they come out the opposite way that humans do, because we have these extra two lobes in our head. And when you begin to understand what makes us special is those two extra lobes, realize everybody always looks at the positive connotation for humans, but you don't look at the negative ones. What's the negative one? Negative ones is the frontal lobes are driven by dopamine, noradrenaline, and epinephrine. All of those are cleavage products from melanin. Most people don't know that. They're stunned to hear that. And it turns out it shouldn't begin to make a ton of sense to you, but some of the things that I said in the Huberman podcast, now why chimps lost their melanin on the exterior, we put it in the interior in us. And that's why our central nervous system is way more complex, but also operates far differently with light than theirs does. Even though they're our nearest relatives, we are the latest new addition that uses light way more, I would say provocatively, in a decentralized pathway. Why? Because we have more real estate that we have to, thermodynamically support. And again, when we talked about thermodynamics an hour and a half ago, I told you, what does it come down to? Proof of work, doesn't it? So think about what I'm saying to you right now in this question you asked about melanopsin. You're beginning to see the skin really is important. It really is a direct pathway, because without the skin, are you going to be able to run the extra territory in your head? The answer is no. So then I want you to think about humans. We invented clothing, we think about 600 to 700,000 years ago. How do you think that affected it? Then think about some of these things in natural history that you know about, but you've never connected to your framework. Neanderthals, who were the nearest Homo to us, had 125 grams more in our head. Their skeletons haven't been found over the 51st latitude. What does that tell you? The higher latitude you go when you have more brain, the worse it is. What does that mean? It means light is really important when you have a Ferrari engine in your head. The story is right there. And what happened? Neanderthals bonded with Homo sapiens, us. We dominated. Where did we come from? East African Rift, equatorial light. But it turns out we have less brain tissue than they did. And what happened? We lost our hair. In other words, we were more thermally efficient than the Neanderthals were, even though they had more real estate in their head. So there's a story there for you to learn. And the implications of that story, not that I want to bore you with this, but the implications of that story, some of my good friends, like even Rick, I think when I said it the first time in some of the blogs that I wrote, I want you to think about cave people. When Neanderthals started to live in caves because they were in Germany, that's where the Valley of Neanderthal is. It's at the 51st latitude. That's where they were found. They began to live inside and they put animal skins on them. What was the effect of that on them? It blocked sunlight from melanin, and yet they had 125 grams more. What is one of the things that we started to see in human history 65,000 years ago? They started to make cave paintings on the wall. You know where you get cave paintings from? Dopamine. Because guess what? When you block UV light, your cells become hypoxic. You break down melanin to dopa and dopa to dopamine. So guess where creativity comes from? It's a cognitive de-evolution. How do you like that?
So that's mind blowing because I actually wanted to ask you. I noticed I am most creative at like 2 in the morning when I know I'm kind of disrupting my circadian
Now you know
rhythm.
why. Now you know why. Because you're
Wow.
creating hypoxia, but you know what you're doing? You're destroying melanin in the process to create dopa, to create dopamine. Dopamine is what does that. That's exactly the reason why the mafia put blue light in casinos, because they realized the effect. And then they gave you alcohol on top of it because they didn't have to stick you up. They just put the hands in the pocket by using the light. But you don't realize that Michelangelo, Sistine Chapel, all the things that humans did in the Renaissance is a function of actually destroying the melanin. You know what the difference was? Remember what I said to Rick and Huberman at the foot of Michelangelo's statue? Michelangelo's statue is naked and the sunlight hit it. And I said, what's the difference between perfection and my fat ass? And I realized it was the light. And I realized when you're in the light, how do you charge the battery? The way you charge the battery is with melanin. And that means the way melanin is degraded is a big part of the story. What's the name of the pathway that Rockefeller University found and tried to bury from us? The leptin melanocortin pathway. Starting to feel me yet there, Mike, how this is all linked together? Why this story of decentralization and putting all the pieces together? It's like the Tool song, Schism. The only way you can see the way things are put together is when you understand how they fall apart. One of the benefits for me falling apart as a centralized physician and seeing how my physiology failed, seeing how my patient's physiology failed, when I stood and looked at Michelangelo's David, I realized there had to be a mechanism in us and how not only do we use light, but how we capture it. And then once we capture it, how it's used further. And it turns out the Melanopsin system, which is what you asked me about, is one of the ways in which we use light. And that system is codified in that one gene called POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin. And when you begin to realize that that gene is the target of the leptin receptor in the hypothalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, notice how you're starting to hear all these words. You may not know what they are, but you know the one thing Uncle Jack's telling you? They're all freaking connected in the same part of the mammalian brain, and that's been true for 300 million years. And there's proof that this pathway is in us. The mammalian dive reflex is one of them. Every mammal on the planet has it. And the reason it has it is tied to this pathway. And when you begin to understand what this pathway is physically doing with light, water, and magnetism, I promise you, you will not have to go out and read Dave Asprey's books. You will not have to go out and read Peter Attia's books. You will sit down with me in El Salvador and you will become the wisest mammal you ever could imagine. And you will begin to see a story unfold for you that is the greatest story on the planet. How we really work. And I promise you, it will transfix you just like it's transfixed me, because this story is unbelievable. The collateral effects, the implications, the twists and turns. Like I just gave you a little twist and turn about really remember what the age was called before the artist? It's called the Dark Ages. Think about that for a minute. Because they were out of the light. And then all of a sudden, the Renaissance painters came because they got into the light. And all of a sudden, what started to change? See, human behavior patterns this. If you don't believe it, I'll give you another story that's linked to the Neanderthals and Homo. Just so you can see that nature really is a fractal. Think about the Anubians, dark-skinned people who built the pyramids. We have all their bones right now. The ancient antiquities guys in Egypt have it. These people have perfect jaws, no malocclusions. Their skulls are thick. Their tendon insertions on their bones are spectacular. Now we have the mummies, who are the guys living inside the temples who had all the money, were centralized, and they were falling apart. They had all the diseases that people in the United States have today. And do you know what that was a story of? That was a story of blocking the light. See, it doesn't just take LED light for you to see this story throughout human history. The problem is, when are you going to see the story? When are you going to see the story of how alteration of light, water, and magnetism leads to disease? It led to diseases 5,000, 6,000 years ago, just like it's leading to disease now. But the diseases that we're seeing in the 20th and 21st century are happening at a much faster rate than they've ever happened before, because of this non-visual photoreceptor system that you just brought up, Mike, when you said, Jack, I don't know that much about it. And hopefully, through this little sojourn through my brain, you'll begin to say, maybe I need to learn a little bit more about the system, because it seems like it might explain more things than we thought. And see, that's the beautiful thing about decentralization. You think what you're getting is one benefit, but what you'll find out is the benefit you get back is asymmetric. There's 100-fold benefit. This is the reason why I'm also passionate about Bitcoin. The same thing is true. You think you're doing it just because of rehypothecation of money, but it turns out that Bitcoin is going to be fully capable of ending wars in the world. There'll be no reason to have them anymore. In other words, man can become fully decentralized. Do I think that modern man, for the last 5,000 years, has taken a step back from an evolutionary standpoint? It's, punctated evolution, like Stephen Jay Gould used to talk about. We don't look at it like that because we're the modern humans. We think that we're far and above because we went to the moon and we did all these things. But we don't realize that even though we're living longer, we're only doing that because now we're using things that we shouldn't be using. And are you really living a life when you spend more money on drugs than you do on food, or then you go on vacation? The answer is no, you're not. And the point that I want people to understand is that when you realize the story is in your face when you go to the Museum of Modern Art, you will see the painters that painted the light. They painted the light before the changes actually happened. You want to know the reason why Monet did some of the things he did? He was presupposing what Einstein was getting ready to come up with. That is what quantum entanglement's all about. And most people who listen to this will say, there's no way that I believe that's the case. But then again, you didn't know why cave paintings showed up when they showed up either, did you? Until I mentioned it. It's a proof positive that changes have gone on our frontal lobes that led to our creativity. Creativity is not a positive event from evolution. It actually is a negative event.
Yikes. Well, I'll have to take that into consideration because 2 a.m. writing is one of my favorite things to do. I'll have to figure that out. But
you know what?
yeah.
I agree with you.
So I'm wondering, like, based on these mechanisms and pathways that you described, would this be the same reason that something like near and far infrared saunas have as much benefit in the research as there seems to be? Is that kind of supplementing a piece of the sun to stimulate these pathways?
Well, let's put it this way. when you're asking me this question, I'm going to presuppose something. You're talking about the stuff that's on the market now. The stuff that's on the market is garbage. But let's get to the real crux of the issue. Why do people in Scandinavia use geothermal and saunas? And why does it help them? Because the light sucks. So the answer to your question is absolutely no doubt about it, because it augments the infrared A part of the story. Okay. So your answer is right. But the stuff that, guys are selling right now, like centralized, like the supplement chillers, that stuff is too underpowered. Now, if you're going to go sit in a geothermal pool like in Iceland, or you're going to have a sauna like they do in Finland, I'm 100% behind that. When you're using the infrared power of stones and light to change things, then I think it's hugely beneficial. But if you're going to tell me that you're going to use something made by some centralized entity in Minneapolis, who's selling you, no, I think you're wasting your money there. Build a real sauna.
Okay, got it.
Build a real geothermal unit.
Well, that makes sense. And let's see. You also mentioned, kind of on the flip side of this, we talked about the sauna. I heard you on a podcast mention that Wim Hof, you're a fan of what his message has led to, but you're not exactly a fan of his breathing style. I think you even said it could be harmful. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've never publicly come out and said anything bad about Wim because I like him, and I think that he's done more to bring people to the cold than anyone else. But my members always want me to tell the truth. So I wrote a blog post on Patreon about the Bohr and Haldane effect. Those are the two quantum effects of how breathing fundamentally works in humans. When you read those effects and you understand them fully, and then you think about the things that Wim has publicly talked about in his talks, you'll begin to realize that they are, how shall we say, incongruent. But Wim's story is good, okay? So what am I trying to tell you, Mike, about this? If a guy has a centralized version of a story, but it leads to the right thing, Uncle Jack isn't going to say too much about that. Why? Because you're still doing the right thing. Now, when you happen to be a wise mammal and you ask me my direct opinion, no, I'm not going to probably put it out there publicly and embarrass anybody, because he's doing good by the people he's trying to help. Then I do what I do. But if you want to know the details of why the breathing technique is important and why you need to learn about it, like I always try to direct people to Erwin LaCour. Erwin LaCour is a good friend of mine. He was one of the original speakers at the Paleo FX conference in 2011. He's the only guy in that entire conference that I thought had it right at that time. And I've always respected him for the things that he's always taught people. He's a great guy. He's a great human being. You can see what he's done, with his own two children, turning them into little wilded humans. He now, and to his credit, when I went through his cold training with him, I guess it was in 2014 or 2015, he still didn't have the story right on breathing. And at that time that I spent time with him, I said, Erwin, you really need to look into this, because everything else you're getting right. Now he's got the story on breathing completely right. And you can see him take off. Like he's doing things now that free divers do, down in Key West when, they dive 200 feet of water and are able to get lobsters where, you need lobster traps for. Erwin now can teach people to do that so they can run through the forest, or they can go up to the top of the mountains in Albuquerque. Why? Because what has he done? Remember, motor power is also a story about light, water, and magnetism. Your motor cortex relies on something decentralized. Afferent and efferent are reflex arcs. So the afferent stuff coming in is the breathing stuff, also the light signals and all that. The efferent stuff is the motor power that's developed and the coordination that's involved. Once you get everything yoked perfectly, and for people who don't really understand what I'm saying, is your mitochondria, the terminal electron acceptor, is oxygen. Once you realize that oxygen is paramagnetic, it has to marry, the delivery to it has to marry to the spin rate of the FO head What Irwin has effectively done without knowing the science predictably is realize there's other gears, just as the Sherpas do. Irwin's doing the same thing that the Sherpas do without knowing what he's doing. Wim is doing it, but completely doing it for the wrong reasons, because what does he do? He talks as a mammal and shouldn't. He should just show people what he's doing and don't try to explain anything else, because he's really not a scientist. But the things that he's done, the things that he's put on film, the things that he showed, centralized disbelievers, those things are all good, because everything that he's shown is proof of work, that it works. The problem is his version and explanation of it is total bullshit. That's the problem. What Irwin is doing is he's doing the same thing Wim's doing, except it's directionally accurate to actually how the electromagnetic interaction works between the FO head and oxygen delivery. And this is really important in the brain, where motor power is developed and coordination is developed. It's called something called cerebral metabolic respiratory oxygenation quotient. And it turns out in the brain, we are tightly coupled. And I'm talking about the human brain now. We are the most tightly coupled mammal to oxygen delivery in terms of physiologic function. And the brain has something in it called autoregulation. Most people know that the prefrontal cortex, that's where the motor strip is. This is where all elite athletes really become elite, when you understand that you can truly develop that part of your brain. What people don't realize is that the afferent loops that come in to really make that part of your brain strong, it's all through the diencephalon. Remember I told you that word before, the leptin melanocortin pathway? The diencephalon is the thalamus. All 5 of your sensors coalesce into the thalamus. The thalamus sends relays up to the premotor cortex. If the input isn't as good as it needs to be, will the output be as good? No. And see, that's the difference between Irwin and, say, I don't know, Peter Attia. Peter Attia may get 80% of it right, but he's not getting it all right. So there's no way I can ever get behind his message, that the key to longevity is working out in the blue lit gym and taking statins and taking the jab like he's told people. And I have a duty to call that bullshit out. Irwin doesn't have an MD, but guess what? He's done more for human longevity than Peter Attia could ever dream of doing. And that's just the truth. And it just goes to show you that a degree doesn't make you an expert. I think Irwin is much more of an expert on human longevity than Peter Attia ever will be. Now, here's the good news. Peter Attia is a smart guy. He's a good friend of Rick Rubin's. I'm an agitator. I'm agent provocateur. I want Peter to know this stuff, because when I see Peter talk and I see him do things like this, it reminds me of a young Jack Kruse. Arrogant as fuck and thought he knew everything. But guess what? Peter's got the Library of Alexandria in his head for centralized medicine. That means he's only a couple of steps away from truly being enlightened. Like, as Rick likes to call it, tapping the source code. And that's the reason why I think Rick cares about PETA, why he cares about Huberman, because he looks at them as people that are this close away from really seeing where, when you squeeze the grape, where the juice really is. And the reason I respect guys like Wim and Irwin is because it didn't take them to have a degree to have to understand it. They didn't waste all their time. As Irwin likes to say, can we stop talking about the science, Jack, and go do the science? That is brilliance. And that's what he does. That's what he's an expert in. And when you see his videos online, running through the forest, of Brazil or Costa Rica and doing things, you're like, humans aren't supposed to do that. Immediately you think back to Albert Schweitzer and the things that he said about the American Indian, the things that they were able to do, the way they were able to echolocate, the way they were able to use magnetism to navigate, the way they were able to run faster than buffalo. Because right now, we only think that NFL running backs can do that. Well, it turns out that's not true. Everybody used to run like that at one time, but that's because everybody was a wild and human then. And then we changed the world, when we adopted, I don't want to say the white man's way, but I think it's British colonial thinking, into modern civilization. I think that's probably a 2,000-year story where we've got things wrong. And it's not to say that there's not good things about the centralized system. Don't get me wrong. I think it's played a role in our development, and there's some positive or negatives to it. But I also think the pendulum has gone too far in different places. I think centralized medicine is one, and I think centralized finance is another. I really think the big problem is centralized science is one of the things we got really, really wrong. And it's really a duty of all of us now that do have degrees to point out the failures of the system, not because we're trying to be agent provocateurs or douchebags or whatever you want to call us, because we want to get the story right. We want young people who are in medical school now to actually ask the right questions so that the future public doesn't have to face the things that we just faced the last 3 years. I told one of my friends right before coming to El Salvador that I view this conundrum that we're in kind of like when I look at my live oak in my backyard. 250 years ago, a guy planted a little seed in my backyard. Never knew the benefit that he was going to get from that tree. And every day that I sit in my backyard when I'm home, I look at that tree and I think about that guy. And I think about, why do I need to do what I'm doing, like on podcasts with you? Why do I need to go out and be agent provocateur, with some of the guys that I've called out, even in your podcast? It's because I want people to realize that the seeds that we plant today can change the world in the future. And those things can lead to a more decentralized life. And that's really what my hope is. I went into being a doctor for one reason. Is because I thought it was the coolest thing in the world to understand how life really worked. And what I realized is going through the process and coming through residency, I was sold a bill of half goods, half truths. While I learned a lot of cool stuff, I didn't get what I was looking for. Now, I feel like I've got what I was looking for. Now I see the other part that I was missing, the decentralized part. When you add the decentralized part to the centralized part, dude, you can truly change people's lives, and you can not just in the zip code, that you're in now. You're going to change them, in Australia. You can change them in Canada. You can change them in New York. I don't need to see somebody in my office to change their life. They may listen to this podcast, even if it's one person says, I never thought about it, like this. Well, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
Definitely. And I will say, I have changed so much since finding your work about my own lifestyle. I've moved from Pennsylvania to Greenville, South Carolina, which I think is 38 latitude. I have all my gym equipment outside where I work out directly in the sun. You see me with these glasses. There are still so many things I can do. But even more importantly, as a health coach who does this professionally, I do spread your message as much as possible. Everybody, when they think of health, I ask them, I say, what are some of the things that come to mind when you think about ways you can improve your health? Diet and exercise is what I hear every time. And I am on a mission, much like you are, to really add light to that discussion so people really start thinking about that more. And I promise to you to keep that going. And the last things that you said there were so beautiful. It's probably a perfect place to end. So, Dr. Kruse, I so much appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, especially while you're in beautiful El Salvador there, for spreading your message to my audience. Thank you so much. I hope we get to do this again because I have so many more questions, but thank you.
No problem. I mean, look, the bottom line is we all have to do the things that we have to do. We have to push the envelope forward. Not everybody's going to understand every single little thing that we said on this podcast. But that's not your goal. The goal is just remember what the initial question was: proof of work, decentralization. If you continue to strive for that in your life, that's all that matters.